You're listening to the Cow Country Cafe on Beef Team TV. Good morning, everyone, and thanks again for joining the Cow Country Cafe here on Beef Team TV. Today we're going to visit a little bit about some opportunities in grazing management. It's a great time of the year to be talking about some of these things. Just looking at what some of our options are. Some areas of the country are pretty dry. Some areas of the country are pretty wet. So there's going to be, a little bit for everybody in today's deal. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to talk about 5 ways that we can get more out of grazing. There's nothing magical here I'm going to tell you today that you probably haven't already heard before, but I think it's important to review some of this, be thinking about how to incorporate it in some of our management plans. We're going to be talking about some rotational grazing things, talking about take some and leave some, feeding the solar panel, using double cropping, and finally looking at ways to utilize stockpiling, crop residues, and those types of things when possible. So starting off talking about rotational grazing, obviously anytime that we can control animal grazing behavior, it's going to be for our benefit. Livestock, particularly cows, are extremely picky eaters. They like to eat all the ice cream first and leave the rest if possible. They're lazy. They like to lay down by the water. Flat areas, they don't like to move. They don't like to expend a lot of unnecessary energy if they can avoid it, seeking out grazing in areas that may not be very convenient. So what we really want to focus on, at least to start with, is stocking rates are important. Using recommended stocking rates are critical to long-term sustainability of any grazing program. But what we really want to focus on is not how many animals are out there, but how long they are out there grazing. And what we want to really think about is giving pastures a chance to recover, giving them some time to rest, to regrow, and that will give us a lot of opportunities to do a lot of different things in terms of, getting more, first of all, getting more grass into the cow, getting more grass, period, wasting less, those types of things. So, that's the main thing that rotational grazing is going to bring to the table for us. You look at this particular, both of these pictures right here, either on the left or the right, and we've all seen these types of scenarios where, for various reasons, these pastures are way overstocked. You could putt on that grass there on the left. And the unfortunate thing, though, is, over time you end up with basically the picture on the right where you've got a combination of native and non-native forb type species that move in. A lot of our very key grazing species start to disappear. They're replaced by grass species or otherwise that are not nearly as desirable, usually don't yield as much, and are just all around less desirable for grazing situations. And this is really what we're trying to avoid. And rotational grazing can help us do that by limiting the amount of time that animals have to repeatedly graze their favorite forages. Now, on the other hand, this is maybe a little bit of overkill. We've got a tremendous amount of grass in this scenario right here, to the point where most of this is just going to be wasted. This really doesn't benefit us much either. And so what we want to try and do is find a system that works for us that can help us reach a happy medium and provide the type of management system that can utilize these these grasses to, as much as we can without abusing them, but on the other hand, not wasting as well. Studies on this are kind of interesting. When we look at recycling nutrients, controlling animal movements, influencing animal behavior, those types of things, we use these GPS collars. That's what the yellow things are on the cows in these pictures. And basically they just track at intervals, usually 10, 15, 30-minute intervals, just where in the grazing landscape that the animals are. And so we can get a pretty good idea with this type of data. Well, what exactly do animals do? How evenly do they distribute manure and those types of things throughout the pasture? Because, ultimately we want to be able to recycle the nutrients more efficiently in these types of scenarios, and generally rotational grazing helps us do that. If you look at this figure right here, you can see that this is a pasture area. The open dots and the closed, well, it looks like they're squares, and those types of things are data points on cows that are wearing one of these GPS monitors. And so when you look at that, you can see pretty quickly that, cows don't utilize a lot of the area in this particular grazing unit. They like to hang out over up in the upper right-hand corner of this particular unit. There's some areas in the middle that they traverse through, but they keep a pretty tight area on there, and we don't necessarily know why just from looking at this picture. The open areas where you don't see those dots may be elevations that they would have to climb up, hills or whatnot. There may be a creek that runs through there, and they just tend to follow the creek. It's a little hard to tell from this picture, but what we can say for sure is that cows don't move outside of that area of traversing very often, and a lot of those areas not at all. And then, there's some other areas as we move to the center of the unit there, and then a little bit off to the lower right-hand area where cows did tend to spend a fair amount of time. Now, the thing in common with the largest groups of data points, of course, are those black dots, the big black dots, which of course are watering points. And as I'm sure you're all aware, cows don't like to move very far away from the water if they don't have to. And so that's kind of what's influencing this particular scenario right here. Now, if we had the opportunity to break this grazing unit into a couple, 3 pieces and isolate some of those watering units, we could probably get the distribution of animals much more evenly over the landscape. So, rotational grazing, we've got this particular scenario right here where it is divided up into multiple units. We could definitely still see where the main watering points are in this grid. But you can see that much of these areas are the distribution of animals over these areas using these GPS collars. We can see that it's much more uniform than it was in the previous map that we looked at. And so that's just kind of a very crude example of what we can do with some of these rotational units here that can help us control animal movements, give us better distribution, which not only is going to recycle nutrients more effectively, but it's also going to allow us to use much more of the available forage that's out there that otherwise livestock may just ignore. And they may just concentrate on these areas that are easy to get to, or there are certain species that they desire more than others, and to the complete exclusion of entire sections of the management unit. And so, one of the best things that we can do is, if you're not rotational grazing already, is to look into what you could do to implement some rotation. Now, you can see in this picture right here, there must be 12 paddocks. It's completely unnecessary to get that carried away unless the situation calls for it. If you can simply go take an area and split it into 2 or maybe 4 units, that's more than adequate to start a very effective rotational grazing program. Let's talk a little bit about take some, leave some. And I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with the old adage of take half, leave half, or something similar to that. And a lot of that, of course, is twofold. Number one, we have to take care of the root system of our forage species, and we also need to maintain the solar panel of our forage species if we do, in fact, expect them to regrow and stay competitive with other vegetation out in the management unit. And so you can see in this particular picture right here, which is a pretty commonly presented picture, you can see that as you move from left to right in the picture, of course the plant on the left is largely ungrazed. It has this very deep, thick, fibrous root mass. And as defoliation becomes more intense as you move to the right, obviously that's going to impact the amount of roots that are available for nutrient uptake, water uptake, overwintering, those types of things. And so obviously repeated heavy defoliation, once it loses most of its root mass as a result of that heavy defoliation, that's when the plant becomes very uncompetitive with other vegetation that livestock might be completely ignoring, and then ultimately the plant likely winter kills, and the rest of the undesirable species then take over. So when we talk about this, we want to have a scenario where when we graze these areas, and this is another area where rotational grazing can really help us out, is to give us some opportunities to go ahead and graze some of these species, but then take the animals out of there, give these plants an opportunity to rest, respond, regrow, redevelop their root systems, so on and so forth. It makes them much more competitive over the long term. So I said earlier a little bit about taking care of the solar panel of our system, and when we really think about it, that's what the leaves of any plant are. Is there a solar panel that gathers and captures sunlight for use in making energy for the plant? And so obviously in scenarios where we are removing most of the solar panel, we really can't have much expectation that grass plant's going to be able to regrow. It doesn't have the solar panel to capture the sunlight, and thus the plant basically starves to death. That, in addition to the previous picture that we looked at, we're also majorly limiting the root mass under the soil surface, and so its ability to capture the nutrients it needs for growth are also impacted very heavily. We saw this picture before, taking a look at some of these areas that are grazed pretty tight. Obviously, when we look at both the picture on the left and picture on the right, there's not a lot of solar panel left for our grass species to regrow, and it's because these livestock have been left in there and they just repeatedly graze off the solar panel over and over and over. The root system becomes less and less and less dense. It can't capture the nutrients it needs. It can't get the water it needs. And these areas, management-wise, are really struggling. So we really want to be in a situation where we can, every time that we graze a management unit, we can leave at least 3 to 4 inches following grazing. 6 is probably better, but in a lot of cases, it's more practical to leave 3 to 4 inches of that solar panel, so the grass plant has an opportunity to capture some sunlight, capture nutrients, and regrow. And that's not a very complicated thing to do, especially if you're rotational grazing, because it gives you somewhere to go with the animals once they've kind of reached that 3 to 4 inches of residual. And speaking of residual, another component of this scenario is really the feedback loop that we see between the resiliency in some of these areas in terms of the residue left on the soil surface, the residual left following grazing, and how that feeds into nutrient recycling, soil temperature, and various different things. Now, keep in mind that residual and residue are not the same thing. Residual is the standing forage that we have left following grazing, and residue is the, you know, the old kind of the dead thatch that lays on the soil surface. And unfortunately, over the years, we've kind of been led to believe, I think a lot through horticulture methods, that, oh, well, that thatch on the soil surface really limits grass growth, and we need to get that off of there. And so, you know, we rake our yards and do this, that, and the other. And really, that might be okay for a very heavily cultivated and a yard with a lot of inputs in it. But when we're looking at large grazing units where there are very, not very many inputs, that's very counterproductive. The residue and the residual really have a lot to do with the water management in these grazing units. And if we'll take a look at the next slide and talk about that a little bit further, but we need to think about in any grazing plan or any grazing system that we have, how are we managing the residual, the forage that's left over following grazing, and how are we managing that residue that's left on the soil surface, because that does a lot of stuff for us in terms of water management, protecting and insulating the soil surface from the effects of the sun, so on and so forth. And here's the figure that I wanted to show you here. Is looking at, on the bottom axis there, you can see the amount of grass residual, and so that's the thatch, the old dead stuff left on the soil surface, and the infiltration rate on the left-hand axis, in terms of how quickly, when it rains, how quickly does that water soak into the ground. And you can see that as our residue gets, there gets to be more quantity of that thatch left on the soil surface, our infiltration rate is going to go up pretty significantly, at least up to a point. And I'm sure you can imagine in your head, if there is a rainstorm on a very dry soil surface that has no cover on it, of course what happens is, number one, those raindrops just pack that very top layer of the soil down into almost a hard pan, and then all the water just runs off. But that doesn't really happen when we have an appropriate amount of residue left out there and residual that can help slow that water down and give it a chance to soak into the soil surface. This is just an experiment that was done to take a look at, okay, well, in these areas where we don't have an appropriate amount of residual to protect the soil surface, what effect does the sunlight and temperature, what happens in that bare soil? And so you can see that the purple line in there, if you look close, there's the purple line, that's your ambient air temperature. And so you can see by, mid-afternoon, 3 o'clock or so, in this particular example, the ambient air temperature was about 80 degrees. Now, whether you had a 1/4 inch of litter, a 1/2 inch of litter, or 3/4 of inch of litter, it didn't really make that much difference how thick the litter pack was on top of the soil surface, the residue. As long as there was some, it really insulated the soil from the effects of all of that sunlight at the peak sunlight of the day. But the red line there that you see going way up to 120 degrees, that's the bare soil. And that was the temperature of the bare soil at 3 p.m. at an ambient air temperature of just a little over 80 degrees. With no thatch on that bare soil, it rose to a temperature of 120 degrees there. And that lasted for quite a while. It didn't get under 100 degrees until almost 9 p.m. Now you can imagine what that does to plant crowns. You can imagine what that does to infiltration, the soil biota that's there, all different types of. So this is really a big feedback loop that really starts with how we manage grazing wise a lot of these management units. We also need to talk about soil fertility when we talk about feeding the solar panel. And one of the big things, at least In our country up here in the north in Minnesota, one of the things we really have to deal with is soil pH. That's more of an issue in some areas than others throughout the country. But we have very acidic soils in this area in our state for the most part. As you go further south, it gets a little bit better, but it's not unusual for our pHs, soil pHs, to run between a 5 and a 6, which is fairly acidic. And so the big issue, of course, is that there's a number of soil nutrients that really become unavailable to the plant at these lower pHs, these more acidic soils. And so we need to be able to take the steps to amend the soil, bring that pH up to at least a 6.5. And that is generally the area where most of our nutrients become available again. It doesn't do a lot of good for us to, include a lot of fertilizer or other agronomic inputs into a soil that is so acidic that those nutrients really aren't available to the plant anyway. And so we need to, think about some of these soil fertility things when we think about incorporating that into our overall grazing management plan. And, one of the things that also comes along as we move into a more intensive rotational system is, the idea that typically in these rotational systems, when compared to a continuous system where you just turn the cows out into the management unit and come pick them up in the fall, in these rotational units, we generally can observe a much more efficient harvest of the grass. Much less of it is wasted. Much less of it is got manure on it, got trampled down, eaten by insects, whatever the case may be. And so we typically see a harvest efficiency of about 25% on our continuous type pastures. And this, of course, is assuming that we're going to leave half of the material out there to regenerate the solar panel and regenerate the grass. Of course, in a lot of very unmanaged situations, that's not the case. And so we may actually get higher harvest efficiencies on these continuous systems for a while until we have, basically destroyed the main forage component in the management unit, and all that's left is a lot of very undesirable plants that, livestock really don't want to eat anyway. So in our particular area, our stocking rate for a continuous type system is somewhere around 5 acres to the cow. When we move to a rotational system, we typically see a little bit higher harvest efficiency, and thus we can increase our stocking rate just a little bit to about 4 acres per cow. Now, if we are doing a rotational, grazing system, and we're doing some other management things, such as using salt and mineral to move them, influence their behavior in the paddock, using agronomic inputs where appropriate, different things like that, we can typically get that stocking rate down to about 2.5 acres per cow. So in effect, we basically doubled the stocking rate. But that's a very, very, very high level of management. It's probably going to involve some strip grazing as well. So you're also expending a lot more labor in that particular scenario. But when you look at the annual, just thinking about cow-calf pairs, if we're able to increase stocking rate, or we're able to graze longer throughout the year, we can see pretty significant savings on feed costs. We can run more animal units. Those types of things are some of the benefits that we get out of some of these rotational scenarios. Okay, I think it's always worth noting, because it is such an issue up here in the north, in terms of being able to extend the grazing season, utilizing double cropping when possible. There's a lot of interface between cash crop farming and grazing livestock in Minnesota. That's something that we have a lot of opportunities to take advantage of in terms of using acres that are committed to canning crops and cereal grains and those types of things. Those are going to be the most flexible things that can be followed up with some type of grazing forage crop, whether it's cover crops or maybe just planting another annual cereal to graze off. There usually is enough growing season left to get a pretty good crop out of some of those things. There's some areas, especially as you move further south, that following corn silage, there's going to be some opportunities to grow some forage crops for grazing in some different scenarios. But wherever we find those situations, we want to be able to utilize those wherever possible because they're really going to give us a lot of opportunities to better utilize our perennial grass pastures rather than just beating them to death and then wondering why they don't support the animal units that we really would like them to be able to support. Now, of course, with any technology, things change over time, and the biggest thing that we need to be aware of in our entire cropping system is to know your herbicide residuals. Many of our forage crops, cover crops, those types of things are extremely sensitive to some of these herbicides that we are now using on some of our cash crops. And so we're not going to get into that in much detail in this particular seminar because that would take a whole seminar in and of itself to cover, and we will do that at some point. But just make sure that you check your labels on your herbicides and incorporate that into your overall forage plan if you're going to be looking at some opportunities to do some double cropping. Utilizing and stockpiling crop residues, stockpiling grass, doing these types of things wherever possible. There's lots of opportunities in this type of area, in our area here in particular, but most areas, anywhere where there's some interface between cash cropping and grazing livestock, there's going to be some opportunities to utilize some of these scenarios that are very advantageous to us over the long term. Generally, anytime we can do more grazing, it's going to be a more effective situation for the economics of a beef system. I figure that on the average, and I'm speaking very broadly here, but every extra week of grazing is worth about $13.50 a cow over the long term, and that's just kind of based on what our average wintering cost here in Minnesota, which is roughly $55 per cow per month is what it costs to winter a cow here, and so every week of grazing is extremely advantageous. And I know there's some producers that get a little down in the mouth because they just don't have the situation where they can get a lot of extra grazing. But when you really look closely at what they're doing, it's not that hard to squeeze an extra 2 weeks of grazing out of what their particular situation is, which may not seem like a lot, but when you're looking at $27 a cow, that can be some pretty significant savings financially. I also think there's some opportunities not only to use crop residues like corn stalks and things like that, but also to incorporate cover crops into those crop residue situations, seeding some of that cover crop midsummer, just kind of letting it sit there, and then as the canopy starts to dry down, it starts to come on. Now when we turn livestock out there, that corn residue is probably only 5 to 6% protein. We're not going to get a tremendous amount of forage yield out of this ryegrass that was planted in between the rows. But now we also don't have to supplement any protein. There will be plenty of protein in that green stuff that's growing there, that annual ryegrass that's growing in between the rows there, and that will really help balance the diet in that particular situation, and will also stimulate some intake as well, and which should result in much better utilization of the crop residue, giving us more days of grazing. Again, stockpiling grass. It's a little hard. We don't see a lot of that here in Minnesota, but I do think there are some opportunities to stockpile grass. Use it in the fall, use it over the winter, those types of things. Maybe even use it in the springtime, where situations really fit that. I think there's a lot of opportunities to really look at doing some of those things that maybe we haven't typically done. Using some of these wooded areas, I think can be very useful. There's some areas that that could do a lot of things for us in terms of provide us a little bit extra forage, provides us some cover. Maybe we can, incorporate some of this with some winter feeding as well for brush management. Contrary to popular belief in Minnesota, cows can graze through the snow. They have to be taught how to do it, but they will do it. They can rustle up a pretty good living off of some pretty bare ground. If they're kind of taught how to do it, and so there's some opportunities for that. In addition to, in a lot of stockpiled or winter grazing type situations where maybe we get some snow cover, we can encourage, cows in particular, but we can encourage all types of livestock to use those areas more efficiently by using a very limited amount of supplemental feeding. It'll help them break the snow crust open. It helps them break things up and those types of things. And so that's a management strategy that we can use. In addition to the fact that a lot of these stockpiled areas are going to need some additional dietary protein. And so if we can roll a little bit of high quality hay out to kind of supplement that, rather than just feeding out of a single tub, a lick tub or something like that, we can utilize some of these different protein sources not only to balance the diet but also to influence livestock behavior. Depending on where you live, there's a lot of areas like this that largely are not used by livestock, and once the ground freezes, now some of these areas can definitely be utilized by livestock. However, we're going to have to get past this concept of getting cows to graze, in the snow. And obviously, if the snow's 2 feet deep, that's probably not going to work real well. But that is not most of the winter in Minnesota. Even up north here, that's generally not the case. We could teach livestock to use a lot of these areas that largely go unused otherwise. And kind of wrap up a little bit here, as we can also use some different scenarios, like this particular area is being bale grazed to recycle some nutrients and kind of improve the grass a little bit. It'll take a couple years following the initial bale grazing event for it to really show up in the quality of the grass, but it will show up. And so we can use some of these alternative management methods to accomplish a lot of things for us from a grazing perspective. And I think that for most people, that can be a very positive experience. Definitely good for the grass, definitely good for the cows. And so it's just a matter of trying to figure out how to incorporate those things into your particular system. As always, you can give me a call or an email if you have any questions. I appreciate you joining us here again this week on the Cow Country Cafe. Look forward to seeing you next week.